Tanchi, Pat Carabray, Dishinik Ashram. Good evening, everyone. My name is Pat Carabray. I'm a professor here at UBC and a director of the School of Music and the Chance Center for the Performing Arts. I'm also a citizen of the Red River Métis Nation. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered here today on this beautiful part of the world, on the traditional, ancestral, and occupied lands of the Hunkaminam-speaking Hwasqueam people. Wasn't that long ago that the Faculty of Arts updated our land acknowledgement to recognize that we're on occupied land, and it asked us all to critically reflect on the ongoing effects of settler colonialism and structural racism. It's Black History Month, so I also want to acknowledge Black excellence, and you'll understand why I'm saying this in a second. If you know the recent hit song by our moderator tonight, we also want to celebrate Black averageness. It's such a pleasure to welcome you all to this second event in the 2024 Phil Lind Initiative Speaker Series. Our theme this year is pop culture and political life in the United States. So if it's the first time you've been to a Phil Lind event, or if you've been coming for years, I just want to say a huge welcome to you all and hope that you're as excited about this as we are and the rest of the program as well. And I want to acknowledge Phil Lind because none of this would happen without his generosity. Sadly, Phil passed not too long ago last year. And so we just want to say, again, a huge thank you for the commitment to future generations, ability for us to share his boundless intellectual curiosity and to create a space where we can have these kinds of conversations. It's really deeply appreciated. So thank you, Phil Lind. Couple of logistical items. We're going to use Slido for the questions tonight. So if you go to slido.com and use the code hashtag LindSlido, L-I-N-D-S-L-I-D-O, you can input your questions, or you can go there and you can upvote other questions that you want the moderator to ask. And if you're on, what's it called now? X, I think. If you're on X, you can tweet along using the hashtag Lind24. And just one last reminder to make sure that your cell phones are off. So starting with our moderator, and you've probably guessed already, he is a Juno-nominated, Juno Award-winning rapper who's released 7 albums, 5 of which have been shortlisted for the Polaris Prize. And of course, I'm talking about Shad. He's also known for his hosting of CBC's radio show Q and for the Netflix Peabody Award-winning documentary series Hip Hop Evolution. Yeah, it was great to see him backstage. So our keynote speakers for tonight are Suleika Jaouad and Jon Batiste. She is a critically acclaimed writer, celebrated speaker, author of the New York Times bestselling memoir Between Two Kingdoms and the Emmy Award-winning New York Times column Life Interrupted. A fierce advocate for those living with illness and enduring life's many other interruptions. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Guardian, Vogue, NPR, there's a long list. She's also the creator of the Isolation Journals, a community creative project founded during the pandemic to help others convert isolation into artistic solitude. There's over 100,000 people who have joined this particular project. And then we have Jon Batiste, an accomplished singer, songwriter, composer. His album We Are was nominated for 11 Grammys and went home with 5 of them, including Album of the Year. He's composed and performed for many different projects, including the movie Soul, which won him an Academy Award for Best Original Score, along with his fellow composers, and Golden Glove, BAFTA, NAACP Image Award, Critics' Choice Award. We are so thrilled to have caught him the day before he launches his tour to support his most recent album, World Music Radio. So finally, I just want to mention that together they are also the subjects of an amazing Netflix documentary called American Symphony, which is shortlisted for 3 Academy Awards. And if you haven't seen it, I can't say enough about how great it is. So please join me in welcoming Suleika Jaouad and Jon Batiste.
Hi, everyone. We are so happy to be here. And Jon and I have actually never done something like this together before, which makes this evening all the more special.
Hello. So this is a journey of life and a journey of creativity, and we're all on it, collaborating. That's the beauty of collaboration. Life is a collaboration, and everybody in here is a creative. When we talk about creativity and we talk about living, then you're talking about improvisation. Improvisation exists in a conversation, just as this lovely human being that is my wife just said, we've never done this before. The energy that we're experiencing is a reciprocal emotional relationship. It's like nature. It's like the stars and the planets. Everything's interconnected. We're all interconnected. So when I think about politics and popular culture, it's so incredibly interconnected, yet our discussion and the late discourse around it has been so segmented. The lack of collaboration and the lack of understanding of why we are all in this together and how that's the only way we can move forward is lost. So when we started to talk about what we wanted to say, it was really the question of art versus apathy. That's the biggest political candidate. That's the biggest foe. That's the biggest danger. The choice of apathy and choosing that over humanity, over togetherness, over love, over political and civic engagement. I grew up in a place called New Orleans, Louisiana. Oh yeah, you heard of it. 504, yes. New Orleans is a very interesting place to grow up in because it, not by its own choice or design, became a synthesis of so many different cultures coming together and creating such its own culture in the process, an indigenous culture of its own within America, which is an experiment that we've been trying to negotiate and amend. And now, you know, you see the world is becoming more and more interconnected via the advancement of technology and everything like that. Imagine the first time ever in the world history where, in a place called New Orleans, specifically in Congo Square, this 6-block radius behind St. Louis Cathedral, you have indigenous Americans, you have the enslaved African people, you have the French, Haitian, Jamaican, German, Spanish, cultures all intermingling on Sundays, specifically in the Code Noir, the provision for the enslaved people. On Sundays, they would gather for a day of rest and the cultures would intermingle and create dance and music and sounds, which was where the birthplace of jazz and the birthplace of all these different traditions of New Orleans cuisine and all these different types of lingo and things that I grew up. Fast forward 300 years later, 1986, I'm born into this. Musical families who have become foundational to this culture and this reality, this new world, have now been steeped in it for generations, and I was born into the Batiste family. I didn't know it was any different to anywhere else. But the thing about being a part of this culture and this inheritance is that it really informed the way that I create. And it's very exciting to be here with Suleika because her cultural background and upbringing is so diverse and such a unique synthesis as well.
So I was born in New York City, which I always think of as the capital of misfits. You may not belong anywhere in the world, But in New York, you can be anyone you want. It doesn't matter if you don't fit in. It doesn't matter if you want to dress as if it's Halloween every day. You get to be you. And I was born to two immigrant parents. My mom is from a very small village in the French part of Switzerland, and my dad is from Tunisia. So if we have any Star Wars fans here, you might be familiar with a place called Tatooine. And my grandmother was actually born and raised in one of those troglodyte houses, those underground houses. And she and my grandfather did not know how to read or write, and yet spawned my father, who is the only person to have left Tunisia, and is a French professor. My mom's a visual artist. But what that meant for my brother and me growing up was that we became expert chameleons and shapeshifters, as first-generation children often are. I remember my first day of kindergarten at Lake Avenue Elementary School in Saratoga Springs, New York. And when I showed up at school, I didn't speak a word of English. And that experience of having to be the translator between home and the outside world, sometimes literally, because English was not my parents' first language, and we spoke only French at home, I think was, in a way, the best preparation to become a writer, to become an artist, where you may feel caught between two kingdoms, and yet your job is to be that bridge over the messy middle, to synthesize the world around you, and to figure out how to interact with it, even if you don't exactly feel a part of it.
We met in the awkward years of figuring that out. You know, if there are Star Wars fans in here, then I know there are band camp alums in here. Oh, yeah. This is a great thing about band camps, is you meet people and you don't know who you might meet. You're flying in from all across the country. I was 14 and Suleika was 12, and we met at a band camp in Saratoga Springs, New York, the place where her father, who is from Gabes and now is a tenured professor at Skidmore Institute. The Skidmore College is where the jazz program and the dance program and the classical music camps all were housed in the summer of 2002. And we met. I was a kid with braces and baggy clothes and perpetually wearing headphones. And I was very much on the quest of figuring out, okay, I'm talented at music. The world is changing rapidly around us. Who are my people? What am I doing with this craft of art, creativity? What is, I know some of you here in college, these questions are arising now, this idea of what is it that we can do to respond? What is our responsibility? How can we ask these big questions, and how can we contribute? How can we be useful? And these are all things that you recognize kindred spirits, and you recognize people who have this sort of path in front of them that is maybe similar to yours in a different way or parallel to yours. And we saw each other and we connected. And we remained connected up until the years in college, where I was a student at Juilliard for the first year of the music program, and Suleika, who is a multidisciplinary artist, was in the pre-college program of the final year of her high school days, playing the double bass in the orchestra at Juilliard. So this person here is brilliant. I'm so grateful. This now is the year 2004.
So it's my first day at Juilliard. I'm riding the one train in New York City with my friend Michelle. I'm nervous, I'm scared, I'm feeling an immense sense of imposter syndrome. And we notice this young man who is sitting alone on the train and is singing to himself and playing air piano. And is beginning to attract stares. And I take a look at him and I say, I know that guy. That's Jon Batiste from band camp. And then I blurt out in the way that 16-year-old girls are wont to do, that's the man I'm going to marry someday. And I completely, yeah. And I completely forgot about it. It was just, a thing I said, and then we moved on, only to discover that we were attending the same school. But I really came to know Jon and his artistry and his heart in the summer of 2011. I had graduated from college a year earlier with aspirations of becoming a war correspondent, and I'd gotten very, very close, and had even gotten a job as a stringer in Tunisia, where a revolution that was later known as the Arab Spring was taking place. But before I was able to pursue that, my life was interrupted. And I received a diagnosis of leukemia, and pretty much overnight, my world imploded. I lost my job, I lost my apartment, maybe worst of all, I lost my sense of self and independence and possibility. And I ended up spending the next couple of months in the hospital in a cancer unit. And by the end of that summer, I learned that the brutal chemotherapy treatments I had been doing were not working. In fact, my leukemia had become much, much more aggressive. And that sense of time that you have in early adulthood, time to figure out who you are, time to figure out how you want to participate in the world, and what you want to contribute, that sense of infinite time was suddenly gone for me. And that same day that I received that terrible news happened to be the day that that very same friend who was riding the train with me filled Jon in on what had been going on in my world. And he left rehearsal with his band called Stay Human, and showed up unprompted in my hospital room, and they began to play. And yeah. As the sound of music started to flow out into the hallway, the sound of Jon's melodica, of Eddie's sax, of Joe's tambourine, patients and nurses and doctors began to walk out into the hallway. And what began as perhaps the worst, scariest day of my life turned into a joyous second line. And patients began dancing with their nurses, doctors began dancing with cafeteria workers, and the whole place was just brimming with joy. But more than that, I think it was my first indication of how creativity can transform a space of confinement, a space of despair, can transform isolation into creative solitude and connection and community. And while I didn't necessarily think of it in those terms then, that would really become the guiding light for me, both in those years of treatment, but also in my creative work and in how I thought about the role of creativity in our lives and our ability to come together, and in the way that we have an invitation to alchemize the most difficult moments in our lives, in politics, in the world, into something useful and connective and even beautiful.
At this time, Suleika was writing a column in the New York Times that was entitled Life Interrupted. And this column is an example of this alchemization, this ability to look at what one may be going through and see the universal humanism within it, the universal struggle, and relate that to others through accounting their journey through this struggle, and other people who have had life interruptions, whether it's sickness or it could be incarceration. It could be just not getting the job that you were looking to get. And the idea of what she was doing, and also the time that I was with Stay Human and playing music in the street corners in the subways of New York City and moving around, meeting different people who were in all walks of life. We would play sometimes for royalty, and other times we'd be playing for the guy that has a bongo drum on the corner of Thompson Street. And the range of people out there, all of these things that we begin to realize together led to the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years. This idea that we're more alike than we are different. It's a cliche and it's very simple to say, but the realization of that through creating art, being out amongst the people, existing with people in the trenches of whatever struggles they're going through, whether it's illness, whether it's marching after the deaths of people who have been slain, or whether it's standing up for the rights of voting, or different aspects of creating space for idioms that have been kept out of certain areas of music and expression. These are all things that we've done to really know what it is, and you can't know there unless you go there. So to exist in the space and to really be with the discomfort of that, be in that gray area, be in between these two different places, these two kingdoms, to exist in that space is really what our work has been over the last couple of years. On the artistic and ideological side of things, that can look like blending genres and pointing out the fallacy that genres of music don't actually exist. Or it could be the film that we did entitled American Symphony, which was, it was about the idea of a symphony and reinventing and reimagining the symphony, but really it's the symphony of life. And the idea that Suleika was brave enough to document this period of time not knowing if she was going to make it. For me to step into this space as her caregiver and also be in the space as a creative, and to kind of dispel this myth of being in the public eye, where there's this terrible idea that if you're on stage and if you're in the public eye and you're a celebrity, that you're exempt from the human condition. Well, mental health struggles, anxiety, all of the things that we all go through, that was another example of us being in that messy gray area with the people and showing them our life over this 8-month period of time. And it wasn't just 11 Grammy nominations and red carpets and nice suits. It was what we all have dealt with. And actually the duality of life is also a myth. It is all at once, everything. We hold it all at once. And that's something that many of us go through, and it's the real anchor of our work. We say it is activism, we say it can be political, we say it's artistic, but above anything, it's human work. And it's work to show that, again, if we stop caring and if we stop seeing each other, if we stop being able to relate to each other as human beings and to see the sameness that we all have to deal with and have to go through, then everything else is lost. And art has this ability to cut right to the heart of that in a way that nothing else can. You could say 1,000,000 words, but the right piece of literature, or poetry, or painting, or music at the right time, it just can express and expand someone's worldview in a way that can change the world.
So, in the midst of this 8-month filming period where we were living the highest highs and the very lowest lows, when I discovered after a decade-long remission that my leukemia was back, a theme that emerged was this idea of survival as a creative act. And what I realized in the midst of navigating this roller coaster, our friend Elizabeth Gilbert said that to describe our life during those 8 months as a roller coaster was an insult to roller coasters. But what we realized in the midst of all of this is that everything is creative. Creativity is a gift that we all have access to, even if you're not a writer or a musician as your day job. When the chemo sores in your mouth make it too painful to speak, you have to find new ways to communicate. When you're confined to a bed, you have to use your imagination to travel, beyond that fluorescent chamber. Or in our case, because I was getting a second bone marrow transplant at the height of Omicron, what that meant for us was that there was a period of time where we couldn't be together. The germ and pathogen risk was too high. And so what I did during that period of confinement was something I'd never done before. I was on a combination of medications that were causing vision issues, and I couldn't see very well. And so the thing I'd always reached for, which was the pen, writing to get me through my most difficult passages, became this incredibly halting, frustrating process. And so I turned to watercolors. I began to paint the nightmares I was having, the literal fever dreams that were making me hallucinate, and to make these kind of self-portraits. And Jon, as a way of enveloping me in his care and his love when he couldn't physically be there, began composing lullabies as a kind of counterpoint to the hospital's many noises, the wheezing of respirators, the beeping of IV machines. And so through this shared creative language, we began to find our way back to ourselves and to build that bridge with each other.
So that's our story, and we're sticking to it. We are grateful to be able to share this with you and our projections of what is to come as the landscape of everything is rapidly shifting and changing and evolving and in some cases devolving. But that's a part of the natural ebb and flow of everything. But one thing I know for sure is that the ritual of people coming together and creating community around creativity will never go away. And that's something that if we want to leave you with anything, it's this idea that anything we're facing right now can really be remedied by us finding that common ground to be able to see each other and to be able to create together. And we often look at the arts as entertainment only. But these traditions, these cultures that we've come from, and the range of how they've evolved over time come well before there was a commodified entertainment structure to house them. They were ritualistic and spiritual practices and ways for us to pass on wisdom from one generation to the next. Paintings, hieroglyphics on caves, all of the different range of expression with the visual language of art, the sound of music, and sacred songs, jubilee songs, songs that people sing when someone is born, songs when someone passes into the next realm, songs where we can get together and have a sense of identity through anthems and chants and singing along. In this time now, we're going to need that more than ever to face the demands of what we're in the midst of, which is this vast exponential growth of technological advancement and communication, and this amassing of information as a means of reflecting all of the different ideas that we put out there on the internet. You know, it's reflecting who we are and what we say and what we do. And that requires us to have a deeper value system than efficiency and scale. How do we address that? It will not be done just within the political realm. It will have to be done through things that have intrinsic deep value and things that consider us as human and consider us in the context of generational identity and consider us in the context of the human identity and existential questions that are surrounded not only in the societies that we live in, but societies from the beginning of time. And that's going to be found in creativity and arts and community. So we encourage you to find ways to build that within your small community, even in your family. Doesn't even have to be outside of the four walls of your house, but find a creative practice that exists within the duress of the time we're living in. And it's not all bad. There's so much beauty, and the joy of living is still available to us. Thank you so much.
It's such a thrill to be with both of you in conversation. I'm just going to dive right into it on your note of deeper values. Because it's interesting how this conversation is framed about pop culture and politics. But when I think about both of your work, I think the central themes transcend politics. They're about what's shared, what's human, what's universal, the deeper values precisely that we desperately need to illuminate right now. So I have a question for each of you on that topic of deeper values. I'll start with you, Jon. Collaboration. So important in music, so important in our shared life. So what lessons have you learned in collaboration that you think we can take into our shared life, our political life, our social life?
Well, the key tenet of collaboration is defining intention. What is it that we're gathered here to do? What are we trying to fix? What are we trying to address? What are we trying to create? I think the lesson that I've taken from collaboration is most of the time, we all want the same thing. We just have different ideas of how to get there. So the cycling through phases of creativity, moving fast, is key in not being precious. Trying things that may not be within the orthodoxy of whatever field or whatever spectrum you're operating within. all of these are ways to exist in a space of collaboration that leads to discovery. Discovery is the thing that we all are seeking when we come to collaborate because we haven't been able to find it on our own. So now we want to discover, well, is there another way? Is there a possibility that exists in the gray area that we haven't considered? And I think we've reached that point in many facets of society where we're now looking for answers, and there is a desire to come together, but we just don't have the language. And that's the beauty of creativity and art, and finding a space for artists at the table to speak to these issues. So that's what I've learned, and I think it's going to happen because it's inevitable that we're hardwired to collaborate. We can avoid it for so long, and then we're going to be like, man, you know what? I got to just go knock on the next door neighbor's door and ask them how to work my TV.
That's right.
I can't get it to get it to come. You just do it, you know?
I love that. Suleika, in terms of deeper values, one thing I think about with your work is the courage to speak about the personal. Because even in political conversations, what I've noticed lately is we avoid the personal. In fact, sometimes talking on that level is a way to steer away from the personal. But how are we ever going to solve anything unless we bring ourselves to the table? So what role do you feel art has to play in that particular problem of our resistance to bring ourselves to political conversations in an honest, personal way?
So I always imagined myself as someone who would help other people tell their stories. It never occurred to me to write in the first person beyond the privacy of a journal until I found myself within a set of limitations that meant I didn't have the possibility of being a war correspondent in the way that I'd imagined. And that the story I had to tell was one that was unfolding right there on the front lines of my hospital bed. And so I began to play with a kind of writing that lives in that blurred boundary between reporting and memoir. And I had concerns about memoir as a genre. It's often thought of as navel-gazing, as self-centered. But what I discovered is that when we dare to tell a personal story, when we dare to share our unvarnished vulnerability, there's a reverberation that happens. That first person I quickly becomes a you and then a we. And when I launched my column, Life Interrupted, I hoped it might be helpful to other young people dealing with cancer. I imagined a very niche audience. But the very next day, I woke up to hundreds and hundreds of notes from people dealing with all kinds of interruptions. One of the very first notes I received was from a man by the name of Quintin Jones, who had spent more than half his life in solitary confinement on death row. And he wrote about the unexpected parallels of our stories, about that experience of isolation and confinement, and that experience of confronting your mortality and not knowing when you're going to fall on the knife's edge. I later went on to visit him on death row in Texas, and to develop a years-long friendship that culminated about 3 years ago when he received an execution date, and Jon and I mounted a grassroots advocacy effort to have his sentence converted from a death sentence to a life sentence. And ultimately, we were not successful in that effort. But in the hours leading up to the execution chamber, he had a 4-hour phone call. And he spent those 4 hours on the phone with the two of us. And we told stories. We made jokes. Jon played the piano for him, and Quinn subsequently accused him of playing a tape recorder because he couldn't believe that he could actually play that well. And at the end of that conversation, in those final moments, I had an apology for him. I said, I'm so sorry that this effort did not succeed. And my fear is that I gave you false hope, and I feel like I've failed you. And he said, this is not a failure. It's not the outcome that we had hoped. But in the weeks leading up to today, I have been the recipient of more love than I'd ever received in the decades before. As part of this campaign, we'd invited our community to write him letters because fostering pen pal friendships was his very favorite thing in the world. It was the thing that allowed him to travel beyond the confines of his cell. And he said, ultimately, that's what matters most to me, to know that I've been loved and to know that I will be remembered. And so that's just one of many examples of how unexpected the reverberations of the personal can be, of the places that that kind of sharing can take you, the people you encounter who you would otherwise never meet, and the sense of unification and love that's possible when we meet each other, not with our armors and our dogma and our self-righteous beliefs, but with an openness to hearing one another, to learning about each other, and to actually speaking in that, laid bare, personal, unvarnished way.
Hearing that story, I'm just reminded again how well acquainted you both are with urgency. Sense of urgency. It's obviously a catalyst for a lot of great creative work. We also live in urgent times. I'm curious for each of you, what has urgency called out of you creatively? And in particular, if there's anything surprising that has come out of a sense of urgency within you.
If there's no urgency, I like to create it. That's the best feeling ever. It's the worst best feeling. I think it's the key to expediting your evolution as an artist. Like, the album, when we recorded the We Are album, I felt the need to make this album urgently. It felt like I needed to get it done. And I have, at this time, a obligation with my friend Steven and the band Stay Human on The Late Show to do, oh yeah, you know the show. We were doing 202 shows a year. And at this time, I'm also scoring the Pixar film Soul. And many other things are going on in our life, our family. And I set up a recording studio in the dressing room at The Late Show. And there would be musicians coming in the morning and late at night and staying throughout the day as I was on the set. And whether it's singers or tuba player or somebody who is maybe even a guest on the show coming by to listen, it created a sense of purpose and a world that was applied to this one project that could never happen again. And I think that's the key. You got to find a way to throw yourself into the thing whether you feel ready or not. And I know somebody out there need to hear that.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Go.
That's right.
I think that's such a beautiful definition of productive urgency. As a deeply anxious person who struggles with unproductive urgency, that's been amplified for me by the fact that I'm back in treatment, that I will be in treatment indefinitely. And let me first just say that I'm not special, right? All of our time here on Earth is very brief, but I live a little closer to that fact and to that truth right now. And one of the things my oncologist said to me when I emerged from the second transplant, and when I found out that this time there wasn't going to be a clear end in sight to this, and that I would be, in the kingdom of the sick for however long or short that may be, he said to me, you have to live every day as if it's your last. And of course, that's the kind of thing that people often say in situations like this, and they mean well. But each time he would tell me that, I felt this immense sense of panic, this pressure to wake up and do as much as I possibly could and make it as meaningful as possible, and wring as much as I could out of every moment with my loved ones, out of every hour I spent working, and that is a lot of pressure. And I've come to believe that it's terrible advice. That if we were to live every day as if it were our last, we'd be emptying our bank accounts and declaring bankruptcy. Some of you might be cheating on your spouses, or eating, ungodly amounts of ice cream for every single meal, but our world would implode if we all lived by that. And so instead, I've tried to shift my framework and my mindset to living every day as if it's my first, to wake up with a sense of wonder and curiosity and playfulness that a newborn might. And while that sense of urgency is still there, instead, I've noticed that instead of thinking about, what I can seize from my life, from my time here on this earth, I'm thinking about what I can give to myself, what I can give to the people around me. And it's no longer necessarily the big gestures, the big bucket list items. It can be a dandelion. It can be a nap with our dogs. It can be walking around our block together. And so that sense of urgency has changed. It's allowed time for rest, which can feel radical in a culture that is obsessed with productivity and output at all costs. It's allowed for experimentation and curiosity, to follow the threads and to take your time.
So usually when we're talking about art or pop culture and politics, what we're talking about is art speaking into politics. But I want to ask you each a question about listening instead of speaking, and silence. So, Jon, I'll start with you. There's an amazing moment in American Symphony where you're just there, at the piano, beautiful hall like this, in the silence. what can you say about the importance, and I should say, I'm asking about silence and listening because I think it's important in our political life too, and under-discussed. But it's under-discussed in music as well. So let's start with music. What's the importance of silence and listening in music, and how might that apply to, again, our shared life?
Oh, man.
Or we can even start with that moment in American Symphony. What were you thinking? What were you listening for?
Well, first off, we've forgotten how to listen. Everybody has a hot take. Everybody is trying to get a headline or a click or a like or whatever the metric is next month. It's actually astounding how much there's a lack of listening, which is really interesting because listening has to be a value in order for people to know how to do it. You got to value the thing in order for that wisdom to come upon you. You got to embrace listening. So when I think about music making, in particular in that scene, that was in the last 10 minutes or so of a 2-hour-long concert where I just sat at the piano with no music prepared. It was completely spontaneous composition, just me and the piano in front of the audience. And what I was doing was channeling whatever was in the room. Whatever was in the room at that moment is what would come through my fingers. And if there was nothing, there would be nothing. And to sit in the silence, that's also music. Prince, the artist formerly known as, he said the funk is in the spaces. The space is where you actually can process what you just heard and how you relate to the next thing you heard. If we have constant takes, constant othering of the person that's over there, constant debasement of the person over there, constant this, we never really have an opportunity to assess what is our standing in all of the categories that matter, and are our values aligned to help us to achieve the goals within those categories. The economy, education, where are we? Have we assessed that, or are we just talking about it? Security. I mean, it's fascinating, but I do believe that if we actually listen, then the answers are a lot simpler than we make them out to be. And that's what you realize in music, especially if you're playing jazz and you're improvising, or you're doing something that requires the cymbal, which is where swing comes from, the highest frequency in the band that's on stage, the thing that's the highest frequency, and you can play it, you could drop a feather on it and you could hear it around the block, travels, to play in lockstep with a walking bass that is the lowest frequency on the bandstand. And the walking bass is the hardest to produce a sound that will travel. Fingers up against strings, pulling. And the cymbal is a stick on iron. And the level of balance, the equilibrium that has to be created in order for those two instruments to house the rest of the band and all the activity that's going on within that band is so profoundly deep and such an allegory for how society could be. I'll stop there.
I love it. I love it. The question I had for you, Suleika, about silence, there's a moment, I'm not going to quote too much of your book back to you, but there's a moment in Between Two Kingdoms where you talk about what do you write about if you might not have a lot of time left? And what you wrote was, I traveled to where the silence was in my life. So can you talk about maybe what you learned about attending to the silence within yourself?
So, we often think in binaries. You're right, you're wrong, you're sick, you're well, you're happy, you're sad. But most of us, depending on the hour, depending on the day, depending on our state of mind, exist somewhere in that liminal space. And so I think for me, I've spent most of my adult life in that in-between place. And often that doesn't feel comfortable. But those long periods of being in the wilderness of survival, of living in medical isolation, first forced me to sit in my own company, which is not something that many of us, have the space and time and quiet for. And more than that, to listen to my intuition. And I was someone who always had a plan. I had my 1-year plan, my 5-year plan, my 10-year plan, and on and on and on. And at every moment in my life, when the ceiling has fallen in on that plan, has ended up being the most important creative growth period and personal growth period, because what I thought should be how I imagined my life to go was no longer possible. And so in that clearing, I had to listen, to reimagine, to find those creative workarounds that we've been talking about. And so I think solitude is something that is undervalued, that we don't make time for. And because I'm still type A and I'm still a planner, I will literally schedule unscheduled time in my calendar. But I need that quiet to hear my thoughts, to pay attention to what's happening around me, to allow some new creative direction that I may not have planned for to emerge. And I think, as Jon was saying, in this time where hot takes reign supreme over quiet and meditation and reading and growing and thoughtfulness, solitude and quiet is more important than ever.
Both of you are obviously here because you're admired for your skill and your courage. Who do you guys admire? Who are your North Stars in terms of this question of creating meaningful work? Shorter question.
That's an easy one for me. I have been obsessed with Frida Kahlo from the time I was a 13-year-old with a unibrow, which was my first introduction to her. But I'm inspired by her art, in part because she, is the kind of patron saint of this idea of survival as a creative act. She's someone who, in response to an accident that left her disabled and in excruciating pain for much of her life, took that very thing that might leave someone embittered, that might make someone turn in and retreat from the world, and used that as her source material, used it as a way to talk about the body, to talk about sexuality, to talk about politics, and And so I'm always looking to her as my North Star, as someone who was a kind of proto-feminist in her work, and someone who embodies what it means to share the most vulnerable parts of yourself, the parts that make you want to hide and look away, and instead become a kind of revelation and lead to that very same reverberation that we've been talking about.
And Jon, heroes for you in terms of making work that matters in the world.
Wow, heroes. I'm a YouTube historian. So I study, it's amazing these days. You can, obviously you can read books, but you can also enforce your reading with YouTube. And you can study interviews and lectures and all types of things. So I go through phases. I guess the constant problem I'm thinking about from the beginning would be my grandfather. You know, my grandfather is a person who has been through so much in his life and has a strong values. We're very much we're similar types of people, but he was born in a different generation. And I oftentimes think about what he would do if he were me now. You know, he was a part of the first wave to integrate the Navy. He's a veteran, and he was the president of the Postal Workers Union of Louisiana, and, you know, was a part of advocating for the rights of the workers during the time of Martin Luther King Jr. and sanitation strike, and was a part of that and part of all the different things that remain in the realm of civil rights and workers' rights. A man of faith. I'm a Christian. I mean, Jesus is on the list high up, number one. But him always saying, keep the faith, son, keep the faith. He's got a whole bunch of things that I think about all the time. He said, keep the faith. Wherever you go, whatever you do. He came to the Grammys when we won. I've had him with us at the White House when Suleika and I were invited to be guest of honor at the state dinner. And all these places, there's a number of places where his perspective, 93 years old, to be in these spaces and to hear what he has to say, and his wisdom is very, very deep. As a matter of fact, let me see, hold on. Sometimes I record him when he's talking, and actually, I recorded him on the album We Are that I was talking about. So that album, I recorded him and I didn't tell him. I sampled him on the album. But then he found out, because when we won the Grammy, he's got a Grammy now. So he won. But you could just listen to him. He's such a huge, huge fan of Suleika as well. Like he read Between Two Kingdoms and his insight about the book, and just, he's a genius that was not recognized for what he was because of the systemic issues of his time. But he still accomplished a lot. Let's see.
You never give up. You keep plugging, you see. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You keep on going. That's service.
Right. Never, ever give up. Ever.
Amazing. So I'm looking at the clock. I think I have time for one more of my questions, and then there's some audience questions I'd be happy to pass along as well. And I think this is fitting after hearing that voice of your grandfather. I want to ask you both about freedom and responsibility and that tension. All of us on this stage, we have racialized bodies, we have names from the other, beautiful names from the other side of the globe. So we carry with us, like all human beings, a desire for freedom and to live and explore everything about who we are, but we also carry with us these lineages, these histories, and also a lot that's projected onto us. So, to each of you, how do you inhabit that tension of freedom and responsibility?
Well, freedom is not a given. So the responsibility is to maintain not just your own freedom, but our freedoms. At any point, and this is just the way that it's constructed, at any point, things can be lost, progress can regress. Democracy is tenuous. It's a pendulum oftentimes before there's forward motion. It's a swing. So I think that the responsibility is to think about freedom as constant work and not as a given, not as something that is just a part of our life, but something that required many to step forward and demand it and command it, and we must continue to do so.
And Suleika, how do you walk with that, with desiring freedom, obviously for yourself as any human being does, but also understanding you carry responsibilities with you?
So we pick a theme for every year. And our theme for last year was freedom and family and health. And, you know, as Jon said, there's no kind of linear endpoint to freedom. It's something that we have to work toward and keep working toward every day. But I also think part of the responsibility that comes with freedom is acknowledging where we came from. You know, my dad grew up under French colonial rule, and so I grew up with these stories of what that was like when he would make a, you know, mistranslation from Arabic to French. What the teacher would write in the margins was barbarique, barbarism, which was their way of saying, you know, the way that you speak, your idioms are wrong. My dad is currently actually writing his own memoir right now, full of those barbarisms and finding delight and beauty in taking that back for himself. And so I think, you know, to add to what Jon was saying, part of our responsibility is acknowledging our elders. It's acknowledging our lineage and who came before us and who paved the way so that we could be here. And so, you know, my responsibility is to live into the possibility that my father's dreams have afforded me, and to keep paying that forward through my work, through mentorship, through sharing not just of the successes, but the struggles, because I think how you arrive somewhere is almost more important than the actual outcome and the destination. And so that's what we've both been committed to doing, both in our personal lives, our family lives, and through our work. And that's what everyone here is doing in whatever way, big or small.
Have some audience questions here. These may or may not have been vetted, just so you know. Okay. With all the press you've done recently, what is one question or topic you'd love to talk more about that people don't usually ask?
What you think, boo? What you want to talk more about that people don't ask? Well, how do you feel about people in the journalistic community speaking about your work? Because for me, I think of you as this artist who is just transcendent, a generational artist, someone whose ability is multi-hyphenate. And I think for me personally, I think that's a difficulty in general, journalistically. How do you, and your work has been incredible in this regard, but framing the context of artists and their intention and how the work came about, it's just very difficult to get to the depth of artistry of a person in sound bites. It's very difficult to excavate all that went into the creative process. And, you know, it's great to do in retrospect, but I think that would be a great thing to have more opportunity for us both, as someone who witnesses firsthand Suleika, and also as someone who's just, you know, I'm a binge creative. I'm constantly creating things, and to have a place where I could discuss my process at length and in depth accurately would be amazing.
I saw a clip recently with Tyler, the Creator, and he was talking exactly about that. He's like, can we end sitting down with hot wings?
Yeah.
Can the interview be about the work and not about how hot the sauce is?
I saw that.
That's great.
Like, okay. Yeah. Totally. This is, yeah.
And what about you? Similar thing, the problem of just concision, and people have 4 minutes to get into your work, and you know, you'd love to unpack it more, or?
Yeah, you know, we spoke with a group of brilliant grad students earlier today, and we kicked it off by asking everyone to share what was on their unofficial resume. And so I think, you know, as the journalist David Brooks wrote, you know, we have our resume virtues and we have our eulogy virtues. The virtues of who we were as a person, how well we loved, what we meant to those around us. And so I would love to do an interview not focused on the professional, but just on that. And I'd love to do that specifically with Jon, because who he is as a human being, I don't want to say separately from the creative, because the two are intertwined, is as extraordinary as the dazzling list of achievements on the resume.
And that goes back to the deeper values we were talking about at the outset. How can we bring those to the surface more? Yeah. Okay. Learning lessons from what the world went through in 2020 together. What role do you think grief plays in political discourse and moving the world forward?
So, I think grief, as it pertains to mental health and as it pertains to how do we understand the impacts of times of change like 2020. I admire the generation that's coming up now because they went through an incredibly challenging time in the formative years of their development. And understanding the impact of that is extremely, extremely vital to understanding what the political landscape and how effective we can be within that realm of things can be. If we don't know what the people are dealing with, think about the generation who were adolescent during the Great Depression and how that informed the years to come. Think about many generations who have lived through pivotal times, all pertaining to how we metabolize the grief experience and how we are still grieving the people we lost, pillars and communities we've lost, the space of safety that has been now a space of alarm. I'm even thinking about not just 2020 from the perspective of the pandemic, but from the rise in use of semi-automatic weapons in schools and places of worship. The level of grief is unfathomable. And for a young person to process that and the impacts in terms of mental health and spiritual well-being, if you want to ask me, ultimately is going to inform so much of where we're going. So I believe it's very important to address it. I think about this all the time.
You have anything to add on that?
Well, I'll just build off of that and say that I think one piece of this is our healthcare system. And I know we're in Canada, you have a far superior healthcare system to the one we have back home. But, finding access to affordable, quality healthcare in general, but especially mental health support, is something that I think is crucial. We didn't just go through a pandemic, we're going through a loneliness epidemic, where despite being more connected digitally than we've ever been before, we have the highest rates of depression and mental health crises, especially amongst adolescents, than ever before. And so creating resources, connecting dots to existing resources, thinking through geographic and financial barriers to access to that kind of care, all of that is at the top of my mind, in part because I'm navigating the healthcare system every day, and despite having immense privilege, it is a full-time job to be sick in America. It is a full-time job to negotiate with health insurance, to try to decipher it. And I don't have any solutions to offer there, but I hear from people who are struggling every day and who don't know how to get help.
Okay, this is not me cherry picking, this is the highlighted final question. It says, if you were to channel the energy of this room into a song,
Yes, indeed. Oh, when the saints go marching in. Oh, when the saints go marching in. Oh, how I want to be in that number. Oh, when the saints go marching in. Oh, when the sun refused to shine. Oh, when the sun refused to shine. Oh, how I want to be in that number. Oh, when the sun refused to shine. Now I gotta hear y'all sing it with me. Here you go. Oh, when the saints go marching in. Oh, when the saints go marching. Hey, how I want.
Oh, when the saints go marching in, yeah. Oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, how I want to be in that number, yeah. Oh, when the saints go, saints go marching. When the saints go marching in.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Indeed, indeed. John Suleika. Thank you so much.